and I'd like to welcome you to this very special presentation of Missing Links, the deep truth of our origin, history, destiny, and fate.
Are you being mind controlled? Let's enter the buzzsaw. Welcome to Buzzsaw, where we cut through the mainstream narrative to explore the hidden truths. I'm your host, Sean Stone, and joining me today is Dr. John Hall. He is a medical doctor from San Antonio, Texas, and the author of Satellite Terrorism in America. His new book is Guinea Pigs, Technologies of Control. He is also an active member of the Mind Science Foundation, dedicated to the study of human consciousness, and he sits on the medical committee of the human rights organization Freedom from Covert Harassment and Surveillance. So today we pick his brain on the eye in the sky. And I want to start by asking you about, what does it mean to be a targeted individual?
There's a subset of the population right now that are complaining of targeting, specifically being followed everywhere they go, on to the extent of hearing voices, suffering from directed energy attacks, really weird happenings in their life that are unexplainable by any other normal means. It seems to be experimentation probably at its root.
So, well, I want to get into the government history of it, but I want to talk about your personal history first and foremost, because you have personal experience with this, and that's what I believe got you interested in the subject, no?
That's exactly it. I had a ex-fiancée that came to me voicing some of these really odd phenomena. No history of mental illness, no history of drug use or alcohol use. So I had no reason not to believe that something was going on. She was being followed by people she didn't know, was hearing voices around her describing her whereabouts and in her locations. So she was scared to go to anybody else. She trusted me, so she came to me, and we counter-surveilled her. Actually set up counter-surveillance measures, including people following her around to see who was following her. And indeed, she was being followed around by a group of private investigators, a company that was owned and operated by a former FBI agent. They had rented condominiums on either side of her, were drugging her food and water with Rohypnol, committing sexual assaults, essentially kind of using her as a sex slave. We did get all the information on the plate numbers, information on the entity that was doing the following and doing the stalking, went to the police. At that time, the Texas state laws on stalking were not that great. You had to prove bodily injury before you could get a restraining order, and certainly if you're former FBI or if you're a licensed PI, there was almost nothing you could do. A combination of our case and another case where a victim actually was murdered by her stalker were what got the stalking laws in Texas changed to where now if you notice the same person following you twice, you can actually get a restraining order against them. So at the time, since we couldn't get any help from law enforcement, decided to basically write the story of my first book, A New Breed, Satellite Terrorism in America, basically to expose that it's going on. Well, unbeknownst to me, once I did a couple of radio shows introducing the book, was bombarded with thousands and thousands of emails of people describing the exact type of stalking in other cities.
So in terms of your experience, you say these guys are former FBI agents, but there was no government control apparatus that you noticed. That seemed to be simply former government agents who were utilizing instruments and power that had been allocated to them from their previous job.
Well, I mean, I think they're still holding clearances because this isn't technology that you and I can Google and get a passcode and be able to access. You have to have a clearance to do this. And I think after some of the initial mind control studies through MKUltra and other programs, we had the Rockefeller Commission, we had the Church Committee hearings, they kind of got their hands slapped. So I think they've kind of moved it into the private sector, basically using subcontractors. As you know, there's more people with clearances now outside government than there are inside.
Precisely. The privatization of power has been tremendous. Now you mentioned certain surveillance instruments that they had to utilize government clearances to access. What type of, because you mentioned Rohypnol and basic gang stalking, but what technologies were they using?
The technology that appears that they're using is a form of technology called remote neural monitoring. And if you look back in the 70s, they worked on this early in the 70s as a way to monitor pilots, where you shoot two dissimilar frequencies into the brain. Each hemisphere will entrain a different frequency. when those two hemispheres with two different frequencies compete, they spit out an interference frequency. And then it was found that you could actually decode the EEG out of that interference frequency. The intended, at least the alleged intended use, was to monitor pilots for hallucinations and delusions and sleepiness. That way you could buzz them to wake them back up when they're flying these 48-hour sorties during wartime. Well, once they figured out that you could actually entrain that EEG and cause changes in mindfulness, changes in attitude, changes in emotion, it began being used on those parameters. Kind of one of the earliest forms we saw of it was actually the woodpecker signal at the embassy in Moscow, where they noticed that every time Nixon went there, you'd have emotional disturbances, emotional breakdowns. And they figured out that certain ELF wave signals specifically can entrain into the brain. One way to think of it is having a EEG catalog of different EEG waveforms that correspond to emotional states of depression or anger, and once you entrain the brain with that EEG, then that person will demonstrate that state of emotion.
So you're saying they can not only monitor the emotional state, but actually program the emotional state into the person.
Exactly.
Remotely.
Exactly. And along with that also comes the ability to communicate, because it was actually found that using microwave energy and using ELF wave technology that you could actually communicate with someone in a pseudo-telepathic kind of way. There's two things that you'll hear from victims, and we saw this with my ex-fiancée that I wrote about, that not only would she hear voices in her head, like many of the targeted individuals hear, but she would hear voices in her surroundings that seem to be amplified by vibrations. And that's the most common thing you see with a lot of these targeted individuals. They'll describe that when I'm underneath a ceiling fan, I'll hear voices in the ceiling fan, or voice patterning. One of the first things we noticed is in aquarium pumps, running water actually has a strong vibratory source to amplify incoming transmissions. And you could hear voice patterning, and then over time, with enough concentration, actually hear the communication. Oddly, this seems to be person specific. So even though the person sitting right next to you may actually hear these voices and hear these communications, you may not sitting right next to them. It still seems to be magnitude and frequency specific to the individual.
Right. Obviously, we are basically water and various molecules that are vibrating at a certain frequency. So the idea is if they can figure out sort of your basic frequency, operating frequency for your brain, then they can get specific into targeting you.
Yeah.
Now, my question then would be, why your fiancé? Because it would seem it would be costly for these ex-FBI guys to basically just be harassing her and monitoring her just for sexual purposes, no?
Yeah, and I think that's a common question. And that's what every targeted individual hears eventually. Why you? I think at its root, it's non-consensual experimentation. I think that's why you're seeing it so widespread. As you know, they'll tend to pick common folks to do this kind of work on. If you look at MK Ultra and any of the other mind control experimentations, they didn't pick people who had political clout or who had financial clout. They picked the common people who have no way to fight back and don't have the contacts in order to stop it. So I think the best way to explain it is there are individual groups in every major city that have access to the technology. I think they're allowed carte blanche to use it however they want to use it, as long as the data gets back to the agencies that are responsible for actually giving the release.
So the idea would be that this is there's a long history of abuse by the U.S. government, whether it's the FBI and surveillance and monitoring of targeted populations and individuals, right?
Oh, without question.
And counterintelligence programs to basically discredit people more from political perspectives, to the CIA and NSA doing various types of monitoring and intelligence gathering. But you're saying beyond that, there's also a history of actual experimentation by the government on the population, correct?
Oh, yeah. The U.S. government has experimented on the population. There's no laws against the government experimenting on the population. John Glenn tried to pass legislation through Congress that was shot down. Most people will focus on the Nuremberg Code or the Helsinki Accord and say, well, these are the safeguards against a tyrannical government experimenting on the public. Those are suggestions. Those aren't American law. You're not United States legislation. So the bottom line is there are no safeguards. As a matter of fact, we had the bioethics commissions that were held 6 different meetings after they found out that Nicaraguans were experimented on with weaponized syphilis bacteria and gonorrhea bacteria. And the purpose of the Bioethics Commission was determine if any non-consensual experimentation was still ongoing, sponsored by the United States, either here or abroad. Well, I spoke at one of these meetings, and they had a public forum in each one. Each public forum had over 1,000 people, and all of them were voicing complaints of mind control technology and directed energy attacks. At the end of the day, they basically said that there was no evidence of any ongoing non-consensual experimentation. Despite having those kind of numbers showing up, complaining of just that.
Well, what are the numbers you've seen as far as people across America who seem to be targeted and are not just coming out of a mental hospital or have a history of mental health, but genuinely having issues of being targeted as far as whether it's private companies or potentially government behind it? What do the numbers look like?
Based on surveys that we've done through Freedom from Surveillance and Harassment and other human rights groups, it looks to be about anywhere from 200 to 300,000 people in the United States. Now, that's just in the United States. I get emails from people globally and messages to the office from people globally every day. So this is a global problem, and I think every industrialized nation probably has worked on this technology or derived it from us to work on their own programs.
And there's precedent. There's historical precedent. You mentioned MK Ultra, and obviously Army Tuskegee experiments on black people, ingesting them with syphilis, I believe it was.
Yeah.
So what is it that what would be your main go-to arguments historically for the main precedent that people could say, oh, this doesn't happen? Well, look at these cases. What are the main ones?
Well, and that's the argument I lay out in my latest book, Guinea Pigs. The first few chapters are based on non-consensual experimentation in our country. We've long experimented on, children in homes for the mentally ill. Some of the earliest forms, at least this technology, were actually on prisoners in Utah State Prison, where we had 5 prisoners that talked about actually having voices placed in their head. They were placed in a room by themselves where they described that the electromagnetic energy in the room was so heavy that they had a hard time getting off their cots. One particular prisoner said that it was very evident that the voices he was hearing in his head were responding appropriately to his thoughts. This was in the 70s and early 80s. And then you mentioned MK Ultra. That all came out in Freedom of Information. Those were 189 sub-projects, all geared at trying to figure out how to remotely control a human being. And it was complete research. It was research based on childhood behavior all the way up through brain implantation that Delgado did. So they didn't really miss any facet of experimenting on or researching on what makes a human tick and how well you can control a human.
And we don't even know most of the MK Ultra work because most of it was shredded, I believe. There's only
most of it was shredded. Yeah, what we did get were the financial records. That's what they were. They were housed in a different building, and they avoided being shredded. So we did get to see what front companies were created and what universities were taking part in, what looked like legitimate research at the time. Interesting thing is now we have the new BRAIN initiative where they're going to finish mapping the brain allegedly, and a lot of that research is being done at McGill University in Canada, which McGill University was one of the big players with MK Ultra. So I don't think that's any coincidence either.
Absolutely. So Snowden came out with these disclosures a few years ago saying, well, the NSA is accessing private companies' data on people, right? Whether it be emails or phone companies or whatnot, and collecting and surveilling you that way. And they can also access your computer and turn your camera on. I mean, very basic common sense things for anyone who understood how the intelligence community works. And this was basically a big surprise. But this seems to be the tip of the iceberg because these guys are far beyond just surveilling us. It seems to be there at the place of being able to surveil and actually try to mind control and manipulate us.
Snowden did us a big favor by releasing that. Yeah, it was stuff that I think is graspable for the normal population that maybe isn't too educated on exotic technologies. But certainly what he did release showed what targeted individuals have been saying all along. You could sit at a computer and look at your emails and see that somebody's reading and erasing your emails as you're looking at them. We found out about the interdiction program through him, essentially where our computers and our phones are interdicted by the NSA and pre-installed with software and chips that allow them to be monitored. Even if you look at some of the relationships that the providers like Google and AT&T have formed with the NSA, that they're basically giving them inroads into the technology. And even though I've spoken mostly about satellite-directed energy weapons and things like that. It's growing. There's growing knowledge that a lot of this is being done through our cell phones too. I don't think it's a mystery that the government wanted to make sure that the population was actually, allowed or given smartphones if they didn't already have them, because the technology that's in the smartphone now is there's a lot of ways to monitor you through the phone and track you through the phone as well too.
Certainly, GPS on your phone. I mean, and most of the apps ask for your GPS. So it would seem actually the private corporations could be utilizing as much of the basically the techniques for surveillance and social control as the government, because the corporations would want to use it for marketing purposes and for sales and profit purposes.
Well, even more than GPS, they have systems now that can actually monitor you in a Wi-Fi grid, and that's through your phone. As long as even if your phone is not, connected to where you're looking for a Wi-Fi signal, it still will send push notifications to your phone and can monitor your whereabouts based on an existing Wi-Fi grid. It's called Wi-Fi tracking, and it's very popular right now, especially in stores, because that way, as you walk down the aisles, they know what aisle you're on, and they know what ad to push to you to make you interested in buying whatever product may be that on that aisle. The other big one through cell phone technology now is called Bluetooth Low Energy Beacons. And that's where they actually constantly manipulate your Bluetooth signal to be able to track you spatially.
But it seems that part of the reason I feel that the millennials didn't really respond that much to Snowden's revelations is because we've already surrendered our right to privacy. That's very much the basis of the various apps like the Instagrams and Snapchats and the whole nature of social media. I mean, it goes back to the creation of Facebook, where some people suggested the CIA may have been involved because the CIA was asking at that point for a way for people to basically put their social political beliefs in a basic hub and locate themselves, and that's what Facebook does, right? So do you see it as that basically we've surrendered to this complete control apparatus?
Certainly, probably anybody under the age of 40, or most under the age of 40. You're right. I think Facebook specifically was started with money from In-Q-Tel, which is a venture capital firm for the CIA. I think it was a data mining tool from the beginning. And how perfect is it? They don't have to research you or do any high-profile counter-surveillance or surveillance. You're giving them all the information they know. The interesting thing is on your comment about the younger generation already kind of giving up, is I do lectures on right to privacy. One of the first things I tell people, don't put all your information about your whereabouts and what you're doing on Facebook and online. And the most typical answer I get from a younger population is, what's it matter? The government knows everything already. You're right. They've already essentially given up.
Mm-hmm. But beyond being surveilled, which is one thing, obviously, okay, we're in a country with this technology that makes it much easier to communicate, to know each other's whereabouts. There is that, okay, there's some level of knowledge, but then there's a difference, which is the actual abuse of it and the actual use of of these mind control technologies and whatnot. And I want to ask, what does satellite terrorism mean? Because you talk about this idea of satellite terrorism, using energy weapons against us, the population. So how does that play a role in what these corporations and the government are trying to do, essentially control the population?
Well, and I think we call it that, or the title of the book was listed as that, is because I think anytime you're being attacked by something and there's absolutely no reason for it. Now, I guess, an account could be made for if you were a whistleblower, and your own, agency comes after you or something. But most of the people I deal with are common people. They're, doctors, lawyers, janitors, teachers. They're from the common ranks. They're not radical political opponents of the government. They're not out trying to overthrow the government. Most of the people I've dealt with don't even vote, yet they're being experimented on. So I think the reason we chose the term terrorism, because they're having pain inflicted on them and actually having people try to manipulate their belief systems through surveillance and attack against their will, which by definition is terrorism, and it's being done by our government on its own people.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the reason for the title of the book, my first book, because I don't think anyone would recognize this as, I'm doing this for the greater good, for the surveillance state or for security. I mean, these people are being tortured. If you talk to any amount of them, they're sitting at home, they lose their jobs. When they do try to confide in their physicians, they're usually sent to a psychiatrist. they'll bring in all their research and where there's obviously 3 or 4 different technological ways to put voices in somebody's head, but all the psychiatrist hears is you're hearing voices.
Right.
And we've been all trained to understand that, well, if you're hearing voices, you're mentally ill. They never asked what the voices are saying.
Yeah.
Because these people aren't describing God talking to them or angels talking to them. They're describing somebody letting them know that they know their whereabouts spatially. Typically what they say, the voices say is, okay, you're walking down the hallway, you're going into the store, you're getting in your car. They make it very obvious to the target that they're being surveilled. But the psychiatrist won't hear that. The psychiatrist, they focus on you're hearing voices,
Right.
let's rope you into a monthly visit and put you on some drugs.
So beyond the issue of mass control of the population and using these terrorism techniques for experimentation, I wonder when I see some of these mass shooters, I think of the Tsarnaev brothers or James Holmes, Adam Lanza, and how checked out they look when I see their pictures, right? These kids look completely vacant, their eyes are vacant. And given the history of MKUltra and given the way that we know government can, and these private corporations in conjunction with government can basically project voices and terrorize and target people, do you think it's possible that some of these mass shooters or terrorists have been mind controlled?
Oh, I don't think it's possible. I think it's happening. As a matter of fact, 2 of them I can point to you. Aaron Alexis, the Navy Yard shooter, he had been in contact with Freedom for Information several times, had complained about the voices in his head, had complained about being stalked and being followed. His biggest complaint was the sleep deprivation they were causing on him. As you remember, when he went on his shooting rampage, he carved "This is my ELF weapon" on the side of his shotgun. The FBI in their release said it was a cryptic message that they didn't understand, that why he put that on the end of his shotgun or the side of his shotgun, when in reality that probably wasn't a crazy guy going amok at the Navy Yard. That was a vengeance shooting. He had a clearance. He worked loosely near the technology with IT. He thought that some of the research was being done at the Navy Yard, and that was a vengeance shooting.
ELF meaning extremely low frequency.
Extremely low frequency waves, yeah. A lot of research has been done in extremely low frequency waves and their ability to interact with the nervous system. Another shooter was Myron May at the University of Florida. This was a man educated, had been a prosecuting attorney in Las Cruces, New Mexico, had moved to Florida to start a new practice there, and then went and started a shooting at the University of Florida. Well, before he went and did the shooting, he actually had sent out USB sticks to several different people with sort of his manifesto and his reason for doing it, albeit I don't agree with the reasoning. His reasoning was that he had to do something really horrible to garner media attention to the problem. I think it's the wrong attention, and certainly we try to dissuade anyone from doing anything violent. But that was his take, that he had been controlled long enough, he wasn't going to be controlled any longer, and that the only way the media would cover mind control was to do something really deplorable.
So is it possible that there is a control apparatus within the government that utilize that? As you mentioned, we know that these private contractors are implementing a lot of the actual harassment, but there could be some branch, whether it's deep within CIA or NSA, that's actually monitoring and deciding, okay, this is a perfect patsy. We're going to deploy this person as our, as our lone gunman, right, or mass shooter, whether or not the person actually does the shooting or is just blamed for it, based on basically culling the archive of who they already have available. They basically amass this population that they're targeting, harassing, and then they can, with some apparatus within the government can basically choose and say, okay, we need to do an operation. This is the person we're going to use as our fall guy for it.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there's always been that apparatus in place. You have to remember the initial studies with this were completely designed to create Manchurian candidates, people they could send out on missions and then revert them back to their normal personality state after they had done something in an altered personality state. Well, the 2 parts of your brain that control those don't recognize each other and don't know each other.
Right.
So, if I were to control you to go do a bombing and then bring you back in and as your own personality and ask you about it, you'll defend to the death that you haven't done it. So yeah, I think a lot of the targeting that we're seeing now probably is actually having a selection of people that can be used in that manner. And that's a scary thought.
Absolutely.
That's a ticking time bomb, as a matter of fact.
Well, absolutely it is. Given the information that you've come across and the people that are being harassed, I mean, what are techniques you tell them to actually deal with the harassment and how to survive this type of terrorism? Because frankly, if you are being targeted and you're hearing voices and um, you're being kept from sleep and all types of techniques are being used to destabilize your life, how do you deal with that?
One of the things I tell people firstly is not to not try to convince people that don't believe you of what's going on. This is so exotic, it is so creepy and so scary that even people who may kind of believe you really don't want to know this exists. It's one of those things that's kind of swept under the rug. Even though it's the most complained about crime on the internet today, there's nothing being done about it really, except for people like you that are helping expose it. So one of the first things I tell people is, don't go off trying to convince your family or trying to convince coworkers that it's going on. If you mention it and they don't believe it or they question it, just let it go. There are human rights organizations that deal with this where you can vent to people who already understand you and know what's happening. The more violent or the more aggressive you get in trying to convert people to believe you, the more crazy you look. And eventually that's going to sit you in front of a psychiatrist who's also not going to believe you. All they're going to focus on is that you're hearing voices. They're going to put you on medications that have side effects that still won't work. The targeting will still continue. Now, in the case of somebody who maybe really is suffering from mental illness, schizophrenia, the drugs do work in schizophrenia. Most schizophrenics, as long as they take their medications, do get better.
Yeah.
With targeting, the psychiatric meds don't help. And I've seen people who have been falsely diagnosed as schizophrenic, forced into medication treatment. And then you talk to them later and they go, yeah, I'm still hearing it, and I'm still got people parking outside my house. I still got people following me. And sometimes it is hard to discriminate. As a physician, I'm not going to sit here and tell you mental illness doesn't exist. We both know it does. But now we have technologies out there that are developed specifically to mimic those mental illnesses. So to just turnkey diagnose somebody as schizophrenic or delusional when we know of at least 3 or 4 technologies that can put voices in your head. We know COINTELPRO started gang stalking and what I actually term organized stalking. It does exist. There's too many cases of it now that I think it's time that psychiatrists, psychologists take a second look. And my whole take on this, and the reason for my activism in my books, has been that there's so many people complaining about this now that the complaints are identical, not similar, they're identical, that maybe it's time for another congressional hearing to get some subpoenas out there to see if this technology is being used on the public.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we're asking the exact people that are doing it to us to help remedy it, and that's been the problem.
One, it's even deeper problem is the fact that the police force and the local police force does nothing to protect people, because that just shows, I guess, how in bed our system is, essentially from the top down and its control apparatus all the way to the local and county levels of policing.
And one thing I will tell you that I was happy to see at one of the local PDs in Texas, there was one lady called the police, and she said, my garage doors are opening and closing on their own. My computer's going off and on its own. I'm hearing voices. It sounds like a buzz in the place. I think I'm being electronically harassed. And I was happy to hear this, even though there's nothing much the local police can really do to help you with that. They can certainly help with the stalking, and that's one of the things I do tell these victims. Make sure you report the stalking. There are stalking laws in just about every state. If you cannot mention the rest of the exotic stuff, they will help you deal with stalking. But this one officer did show up to this lady's house, and he said, it sounds like what you're going through is electronic harassment, and honestly, I don't know how to help you. So I think there are some officers that are being educated on it now. Maybe it's from seeing some of the shows like this, or maybe reading books that are written on it.
Yeah.
I don't think they're all endemically included in the harassment. I think there are good officers out there that still will try to come and help you, at least not 5150 you or send you to a psychiatrist. And one of the steps that we made recently was out in Richmond, California, where we did meet with the city council out there. We kind of pleaded the case that not everybody that complains of this is crazy, because in California specifically, a lot of these people were getting 5150, which means forced entry into a mental hospital for evaluation. The Richmond City Council did agree that to start basically a checklist that the police could go through, where if you're not a danger to yourself or voicing a danger to others, that they would, instead of taking those people in, would refer them to organizations that can help them understand what's going through them. And that's a huge step.
Yeah, and it seems like the whole point is that books like yours, programs like this, discussing it, making people aware of the targeting and the actual reality of the situation can hopefully enlighten people so that they don't sort of look askance or run away from someone who claims to be targeted. And I think the more people are aware of this, the more that we can actually force a shift and protect those who are being targeted. Right?
Yeah, and I think it's working because this is growing. It's not going away. It's not getting smaller. I get 10 to 20 messages at my office every morning, and they're not medical. It's not people seeking me out for medical treatment. It's people seeking me out based for targeting. Every day.
Yeah.
Every day my secretary comes back and it's a stack of at least 20. They need to talk to you about targeting. So it's growing. And it's to the point now where I think if you talk to just about anybody and you mention, have you ever heard of this electronic harassment, electronic targeting, or organized stalking? Just about everybody will tell you, yeah, I had a cousin or I had a sister or I knew a guy that was talking about that. And a lot of times they'll say, we thought he was kind of nuts, but now there's so much about it online and so much being written about it that it's got to be true. And that's kind of what has been the goal all along. So.
Absolutely, raising awareness. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Hall.
Thank you, Sean.
And there you have it, folks. Some fascinating insights today from Dr. John Hall. You may not agree with or believe everything said here, but I urge you to check out his books, Guinea Pigs, Technologies of Control, and A New Breed, Satellite Terrorism in America. Remember, the road to truth is a perilous path along the buzzsaw's edge. I'm your host, Sean Stone. You are the revolution.